Salman, I can't see the screen.
We're all live. I
We are
would
live.
request all the panelists to please switch on your videos. Krishnendra, please
Yeah,
start.
yeah. Dear viewers, welcome to another episode of BW Legal World Presents Saturday Solutions, where we find solutions to pertinent issues. Coming ahead on this week's segment, we have with us a very eminent panel of experts to discuss the startup issues and issues while we register the startup in India. We are joined by Manindra Singh, Associate Partner, ELP, Garima Mitra, co-founder, Tree Life Consulting, and Vanessa Agarwal, founder, Thinking Legal. I welcome you all to the webinar.
Thank you, Krishan.
Thank you.
My
Thanks,
fir-
Krishnendra.
Okay, with your permission, we are starting the webinar now. My first question to the panelists are, what are the practical issues one faces when he or she goes to register for a webinar or sorry, I just lost it. What are the practical issues entrepreneurs face when seeking registration?
So I'll go first, Krishan.
So I want Vanessa to go first.
Okay.
Sure. Thanks, Krishnendra. So, there is a criteria that the Startup India program has for startups, and any startup which meets those criteria can go in for a registration. And while the form is quite simple, sometimes we have seen startup face challenges in terms of explaining the innovative idea that they have, the problem that they're trying to solve. And especially when we see startups which are at a nascent stage, sometimes it's possible to get queries on exactly what the startup is doing. And it is sometimes difficult for startups to provide enough materials to show that they're solving an innovative problem. And those are the kind of challenges we've seen. But the Startup India team is quite helpful and responsive. So many startups do get registered. And it is only in a few cases that we have seen these challenges arising.
And Garima, your points?
I think I just to add to Vanessa's point, I agree that sometimes startups are unable to articulate what they're doing and draft it in a manner that is that can be portrayed as innovative, and that the niche that they're trying to create or the impact that they're trying to create, that cannot be articulated sometimes very clearly. And also often what happens is Startup India registration is one of the first steps that startups take. So they're in their very, very early stage, and at times the product also develops, and they're all in product development stage around that time, most of the times. And the development of the product and the description of the product also may vary, right? So that is, I think, one challenge. Another challenge is also a lot of startups probably in the early stages don't have clarity on whether they want a private limited company or an LLP, and they register for an LLP, but then after that they want to raise funds, so they want to convert into a private limited company. And at that time, if the LLP has a Startup India registration, they don't have clarity what happens if they convert into a private limited company. So of course, but once you get in touch with the Startup India team, you understand that the transition is possible, but there's nothing in the practical guidelines that have been given that can actually help you to understand that that is possible. I think that's one of the major challenges that we've seen that businesses come across.
And Manindra, would you like to add something?
Yes, I think Manisha and Garima has put it very comprehensively. I would rather also speak about when you're starting something from the scratch. I think the founders are not sure of what structure to follow. And Garima rightly pointed out that initially they are not aware that LLP or company model is something that they should be working with. I have, in my experience, seen a lot of founders just starting the business without having anything being there, something more on the lines of sole proprietorship. But later, as they develop their product and get some expertise of their idea and start to get business, I think that is when they realize, no, they need to have a proper corporate vehicle through which they should be doing their business. And that is one thing that I think the origin of having the registration, not startup. Registration as a startup, of course, is a secondary thing. But first of all, they need to be very clear as to what kind of vehicle do they want to have for going forward. So private limited company is one vehicle, of course, that's the most alluring vehicle in terms of various things, be it taxation, compliance, or raising funds. So I think that's one of the most important things that the startup founders need to keep in mind. Second, of course, when they are looking for registration, let's say for a private limited company, where to go, how to go and have the company registered is something that we have seen in our experience, that founders or even anybody who wants to register a company, they do grapple with the issues as to how to go about it. Of course, there are a lot of consultants to help it out. So I think that's one thing where the government has worked very beautifully, creating a single window clearance kind of a system. Invest India is something that's working very nicely on this. With ELP, of course, we have worked last year with Invest India to try and create a single window clearance system where all the licenses for many states, even for registration and everything, you just need to go find out, just put your basic factual questions and you will get the answers as to what kind of vehicle do you need to have. So I think that's where one thing that registration gets resolved. And of course, once you go and have yourself registered as a startup, the basic understanding, I think, is about the product and the services that they are developing. And that's one of the key things to portray when they are seeking the registration as a startup.
Before we delve into the startup registration process, I'd like to understand what qualifies as a startup. From Garima, you can start.
Sure. So ideally, you need to be either a LLP or a private limited company. Also, a registered partnership can sort of register as a startup. And this is always valid for up to a period of 10 years from the date of incorporation. Then the turnover of the entity should not be more than 100 crores. And I think these are two very objective things. The subjective things comes in where the entity needs to show how they're creating employment, how they're generating wealth. And I think these are the three criteria that the startup policy defines startup as. And also, one thing very important is that any entity which has been like split up or is a result of a reconstruction of another business cannot be considered as a startup. That's one main point that a lot of people miss out on.
And what is the difference between a startup registered under the Startup India scheme and the one registered under DPIIT?
So DPIIT is just the body that is regulating the Startup India scheme. So there's no, as such, a major difference.
Okay, now moving to the heart of the webinar, right from choosing the structure to the must-have documentation, could you give us a playbook for the startup registration process in India? If I could start with Vanessa.
Vanessa, you're on mute.
Sorry, I just realized I'm on mute. So yeah, so as far as choosing the structure is concerned, I think most startups are formed to have some sort of funding that they would like to raise during their life cycle. So as a structure, we would definitely recommend that they register as a private limited company. I think the other panelists also spoke about people wanting to convert to a private limited company later. So while it is possible, it is better to structure yourself as a private limited company from the outset. In terms of the documentation and process, there is a form that is available on the Startup India website that the startups need to fill. I think we have already touched on what are the requirements. So there is a write-up required on the business that the startup is doing. And they also ask if you have raised any funding prior to the registration. Usually the startups who get registered, they do it prior to funding being raised. So it's important for startups to have a comprehensive document outlining their product, their idea, what is the profit generation that they have in the future. And the process, once you upload these documents on the Startup India website, It's not a complicated process. It's just that we have to make sure that all the documents that they need, especially focusing on the business of the startup, is available. It typically happens quite quickly, the registrations. There are instances where we get questions from the Startup India team, which can be addressed, and they're quite helpful, as I mentioned. As far as other documentation that is required, we have the MOA, AOA that every private limited company would need to have. And as I mentioned, we definitely recommend having a private limited company. But if people want to go for an LLP, then you need an LLP partnership deed. And similarly, even for an unregistered partnership, you need a partnership deed. Once you register as a private limited company, there are obviously other compliances that need to be done, that you need to get a PAN card for the company, you need to get a TAN card for the company. There are other compliances that kick in once you are registered as a company. So if I focus solely on a company, and maybe we can elaborate on that, in the upcoming discussion. But I think one important area for startups to focus is on intellectual property rights, because we have seen a lot, we work with a lot of investors, venture capital funds. I think investors are quite keen and see a lot of value once the intellectual property rights of startups are registered. So while we'll discuss some other compliances under, Companies Act, labor registrations, etc., I think that one thing to keep in mind as a startup is that one should definitely try to protect any intellectual property that they have, that they are building, and that will have even more value in the future.
And I would like to bring Garima into the discussion and discuss the compliances one must have when they are going to register the startup.
So I think to register as a startup, like Vanessa pointed out, that all you
Both
need is
while
sorry?
registering and after the registration is completed, what are the post-registration compliances one must have?
So even post, so I think the way to look at it is a startup registration, or to be registered as a startup is one of the blocks in a business. It's not sort of a end. It's just means to getting some benefits that the government is offering. And any private limited company or an LLP, once they're registered, they will require their PAN, TAN, and all of that. Moving forward from there, these are the charter documents, or these are the main documents that an entity requires, which of course go on to prove that the entity is in existence, so that the startup registration can be granted to these entities. So I think that's where that compliance sort of gets done. And the focus of Startup India registration, or even the Startup India policy, is to sort of encourage entrepreneurship, to get innovation in the industry, which is why I think the reliance, so the reliance that is placed on providing the startup registration is on various questions, like if you're going to, how are you going to generate employment, revenue, or what problems are being solved by your startup, or what is the innovation or the uniqueness of your product. And these are some of the questions on the portal, which sort of, once you answer them, determine the status of your startup registration. And I think whether you do compliance or not after getting the Startup India registration is a completely different topic of discussion, I feel, because as startups, compliance is one of the most important things that have emerged in the past decade. I think earlier, when startups were coming up, they were not really concentrating on compliance procedures and things like that, whereas now, given the regulatory changes, the sort of ease in a little bit of ease in administration, and also the regulators becoming stricter, startups have started placing a lot of importance on compliance. That's a mental shift that we've seen. So whether there is no, there is a mandatory requirement that the compliance be done by a private limited company or LLP. And those can be anything ranging from getting your shops and establishment license, getting your professional tax registration, getting your labor registrations. But all of those are irrespective of whether you have a Startup India registration or not. So those have to be done irrespective of whether you have a status of a startup or not.
And would it be fair to say that we are moving into a paperless self-certification regime?
Yes, we are moving towards it, but we're not there yet, of course.
All right, now I would like to move on the government's policy and incentive regime. And let me bring Vanessa back to the discussion. First of all, how would you rate government startup policy and incentives?
Krishnendra, I think that the government has really done a good job of not only offering incentives, which has helped to develop the ecosystem, but also having an ear on the ground and making sure that the policy evolves to kind of keep up with the requirements of the startup ecosystem. Because as we have seen in the past few years, the startup ecosystem in India has recently evolved to a great extent. We have a number of startups which are now listed. We have unicorns which are being minted all the time. So I think that the policy is very much helpful for startups. And also the evolution that is happening in the policy is definitely helpful. So I'll give you an example. I think what we hear from our startups is that, the ESOP policy, and, bear in mind that now you have so many people who are keen to join startups, and everyone who joins a startup is more keen to receive ESOPs from startups. And in fact, in 2022 already, we have seen Indian startups do a buyback of ESOPs of over 53 million USD. So this is something that has happened because the government has supported the ESOP policies. So, the startups are allowed to issue ESOPs up to 10 years of incorporation. The taxation regime for ESOPs was also made more helpful in the past 2 years. So the ESOP taxation was deferred for 5 years, which has also helped evolve the ecosystem. There are a number of other incentives that the government offers to startups. So there is fast tracking of patents that the government has offered to startups. We have a number of startups who have availed benefits under this fast tracking of patents, and they have actually got patent registrations in record times. So the policy is definitely helpful. There are particular aspects of the policy which are even more helpful, like the ESOP or the patent fast tracking, because these actually help them grow. While there are other, there are also tax incentives which the government offers to startups. So I think they are very helpful. They are also very much in tune with what is happening in the ecosystem. So they are able to adapt the policy and see if there are any other areas that could help startups grow.
And could you please delve into the IPR protection available?
Yeah, sure. So there is a form that startups can file to get the fast tracking of their patents done. We have seen startups get patent registrations in under 18 months by filing this form. There are also facilitators which are available on the Startup India website who can help with the patent application and examination. And there is also they also offer rebates while you are filing applications, and this is a scheme that a lot of our startups have been able to get benefits under.
And now coming back to Garima now, I would like to know about the tax exemptions available.
So I think I'll start with the most critical tax exemption and the most commonly used tax exemption, which comes under for the angel tax, basically the Section 56 exemption that startups get, and this is one of the most easiest ones. So generally, Section 56 to 7B of the Income Tax Act basically says that if you are going to make investments which are above fair market value, and the fair market value has to be determined by a certain rule, then the investment or the value that you have paid for those shares, which is above fair market value, will be taxed. right, to the company. Now, this was a matter of concern for a lot of startups. In India, a lot of startups in their early days have also received notices from the Income Tax Act under this. And this is generally comes into play when the startup is raising very early stage capital and is raising funds from angel investors, right? So this does not apply to VCs, but it does apply to individuals who are investing in startups and everything. So I think a very, very big welcome change that Startup India had introduced was the tax exemption on investments, on such investments. So when you are registered as a startup, you have an option to go and seek exemption under Section 56 through a different application that is made in the same way that a Startup India registration is done. The prerequisite for that is that you need to have the Startup India registration. So once that is done, and that's you make a declaration as the promoter in the company, the companies are eligible to take that exemption. So that's one of the major tax exemptions that you can see under the Startup India regime. Then, of course, there is the tax exemption under 80IAC, which basically gives you a 3-year tax holiday. Now, the eligibility criteria for this is that your startup has to be incorporated after 1st April 2016, and you have to prove the innovation that is there in your company, right? So this is again a different application that is made after you are a eligible startup under the scheme. And there is a DPIT will basically give you an exemption for that. In our experience, while a lot of startups apply for this exemption, not everyone gets it. It's slightly difficult. It's also a little bit subjective on who gets this, who doesn't get it. So the application that is made needs to be very, very crystal clear. And it's not as simple as the angel tax exemption, but yes, this is one of the benefits, and one of the big benefits that the Startup India policy, when it had come in, also had sort of publicized the fact that they were giving a 3-year tax holiday. Then I think a recent change that has happened is also in the tax regime is the exemption to eligible startups under Section 54 GB of Income Tax Act, which gives individuals and HUFs the power or the right that whatever money that they're getting from their capital gains can be invested into a startup. Of course, there are certain thresholds and limitations that need to be followed, and they come with certain different conditional things, conditional provisions. That is one of the tax exemptions. And I think lastly is that, so in India, basically closely held companies, you're not able to set off carry forward losses, which is again exempted for startups, provided that they have certain thresholds and they come in the criteria to get that exemption.
Thank you for touching the aspect of tax exemptions with such clarity. Now I'd like to address a very Googled question when it comes to startups in India. How does someone go about funding? And I'd like to bring Maninder back to the discussion. Could we explain the process of funding? And what are the parameters investors are looking at?
So the question is primarily from the point of view of investors.
Yeah.
Okay. See, I think on a holistic basis, when investors are looking at providing funding to the startups and trying to create wealth or value out of those startups, there are few things that the investors would definitely look at. One is the kind of corporate structure that the startup has adopted, the number of years of existence that the startup has, the compliances that the startup has done over a period of time, whether they have been done on time or not, if there are any proceedings that have been issued that being taken against those startups, Going on to the business aspects, I think the important thing that the investors will look at is how the business is being carried out by those startups. Whether it's, for example, let's say the IPR, right? The IPR of the in which the company is doing business, whether it is registered in the name of the promoters or it is registered in the name of the company, because the funding is primarily going to the company, and they would want to understand whether all the rights with respect to the business which are being carried out are vested with the company or not. For example, there's a land on which the company is doing its business, but if the land is leased out to the company by the promoter, then there is always some ambiguity of the continuity of business. Of course, there are ways and means to have some solutions around it. That is another important thing from the business perspective that the investors will look at. And third, of course, how promoters have gone about building the business, the kind of profits, if they have created over a period of time, what is the value in the idea that they are trying to generate, the various registrations that they have sought over a period of time. I think those are certain key things that investors will look at. Of course, when they do invest in a startup or be in any company, there is a laundry list of due diligence checklist which is there, basis which various responses are given to the investors. The team, the lawyers team, the business team sit together, they try and find out if there are any problems, how to come out about the solutions for those. But I think on a holistic basis, these are the important issues that the investors will look at.
And what has been your experience with the promoters? Are they aware of their contractual rights?
See, I think there is a lot of awareness that's coming in the promoters, and of late, of course, the newer breed of the founders. What, in my experience, I think I've been lucky enough to deal with a lot of founders who are quite aware of their rights in terms of what do they want to do about their business. But when it comes to the legality and all the technical stuff about the laws and everything, that's where I think we step in. They are aware about the what do they want to achieve, but there are ways and means for which they of course come to us. We help them out that this is how you should be focusing on. For example, there are a lot of clauses in an investment document, be it the share subscription agreement or shareholders agreement, which is one of the key documents when a funding is done. Be it, let's say, there's a good lever situation or a bad lever situation, they are aware that there could be a situation where if they are not performing well for the company, they may be asked to leave the company. But there are the language of those clauses is something that needs to be closely looked at, and that's where I think they do reach out to the lawyers and ask them for their inputs. For example, transfer restrictions in the document, whether they can transfer their shares or not, vesting of the shares, whether there is a put being put on the promoters or not. So on an overall basis, they are aware that what can happen if something goes bad tomorrow. But having said that, there is definitely a need of lawyers to ensure that business angle is one thing which is definitely taken care of, but the legal language is something there to protect the founders.
All right. And Vanessa, if you could briefly give an overview of the financial instruments that are used for startup funding. Are we tilting more on the equity side?
Sure. Yeah, I think that a lot of transactions are happening on the equity side. And one instrument that has recently kind of gained traction in India, especially for the initial rounds, is a safe note. So it's a simple agreement for future equity. This is already quite popular with incubators such as Y Combinator in the US. But we've seen them gain traction in India as well. So this is a type of equity where the valuation is actually done at a priced round, and this is used by a number of startups to raise seed funding now. Otherwise, we see a lot of convertible instruments. So we could see convertible debt instruments. We see convertible instruments which convert to equity ultimately. There are obviously debt transactions also happening, but typically founders prefer to raise equity or instruments that are ultimately convertible into equity. And we see a CCPS, which is a compulsorily convertible preference share, as being the go-to instrument that investors use to invest in startups. And these are instruments that are issued as preference shares and convertible to equity at the option of the investor or upon happening of certain events. The CCPS gives some flexibility to the investors and the company to do price adjustments in the future in case of a down round or in case of certain other situations. So CCPS and equity is something definitely that we see very commonly in funding transactions that are happening in the ecosystem.
Manindra, your thoughts?
So, Krishnan, there are of course various nature of instruments which are available through which the funding can be received. What we have, of course, observed that founders are initially reluctant to dilute their equity, and that is where the whole concept of coming up with different instruments has arisen. CCPS is, of course, one of the favorite instruments to go to when it comes to raising funds. We are also seeing a lot of venture debt fund coming up, so that there is enough supply and there is enough demand in the industry. As more startups are growing, we are also seeing a lot of variations of the hybrid instruments also being coming up. So we have noted that there are a lot of deals in which there is going to be a mix of equity and debt and convertible instruments as well. So depending on the business need of the startup founders, and of course what is the kind of trust and the faith that the investors repose in the founders, so they may want to structure it in that fashion. For example, if there is a money that they are giving, they want immediate returns to an extent to lower their exposure to the company. They may also want to have a debt instrument in the company. There are also options of convertible notes, which is available to a startup to startups. So I think that on an overall basis, there are a lot of instruments. Depends on the business need of the company and of the investors. And basis that there are a lot of structures that are available.
And what happens when startups fail? How is the exit taken care of?
So there are various clauses which are there when it comes to the exit option. Usually liquidation preference is one of the important clauses that is negotiated in a startup environment. Liquidation preference allows the preference shareholders to get their money out of the company if the company goes down the drain, company is going for winding up, or if the company is being taken over by somebody where the startup founders do not continue as a controlling body. So liquidation preference is an important aspect in that sense. We see all kind of variations there, be it 1x, 1.2x, 1.5x, or 2x, depending on how the negotiation is done on the liquidation preference. So that's one of the important clause to have when it comes to when the company fails. When it comes to, of course, there are other options also. If the company doesn't do good, there are put options which are there with the investors. They may want to put their shares back on the promoters of the company, ask them to buy them out at a certain valuation. Buyback by the company is also an option, but of course, if the company has failed, it's not going to be of any use because company doesn't have the money. So I think liquidation preference is the go-to option in that situation.
Point well taken. Vanessa, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that, Manindra is absolutely right that liquidation preference is what investors look to, kind of help them in a situation where a startup may not be doing well. While, we read headlines of various startups raising future rounds of funding, turning into unicorns, it is obviously a risky investment class. And these situations do happen. We have seen a lot of write-offs also happening. So there are situations where a startup does not work, and then there is not much that the investors are able to recover from the company. In which case there is a write-off, or maybe the startup founders buy the shares from investors at the face value, which is usually 10 rupees a share. So while liquidation preference is definitely something that investors look at, it's especially for very early stage companies which have raised only angel rounds, it's not really possible for investors to even get the investment amount back from these companies, in which case it's possible that they may just get the face value of the shares.
Right. So is the winding up easy when it comes to startup? Can we delve in the process a little bit? Vanessa, you go first, and then Garima may add.
Sure. Yeah, so there is the winding up process for startups. There is an incentive which is offered by the government, and the winding up process that the government has for startups is helpful, and it can be actually done within 90 days of filing an application. They usually appoint an insolvency professional who is in charge of the winding up. And once the appointment is done, they quickly do the process and make sure that the winding up happens in a timely manner for startups.
Garima, would you like anything to add to this discussion?
So I think for us, we've always had this thing that in India now it's very easy to open up a company, but to wind up a company is a slightly longer procedure than what it is to start up. Starting up is easy, but closing down is slightly tedious than opening up, right? So like Vanessa pointed out, of course, 90 days is what the IBC gives you. And basically the insolvency professional has to basically pay off the creditors and everything within a period of 6 months. So that is, of course, fast tracked. But when you talk about startups being a risky investment, a lot of investors, I think, work on the principle of spray and pray, right? So they invest in probably 10 startups, and they pray that at least one of them gives them the return for all of them. So it's a high risk asset class, and I mean high risk, high reward asset class. So that's the investment ideology and winding up of a company and all of that is sort of it doesn't blend together currently. So I think there's a lacuna in the regulatory framework where startups, though we encourage entrepreneurship and have the government has made starting up easier, winding up, of course, is more difficult and a tedious process comparatively.
Thank you for the clarification. Now I'd like to have a quick round of closing comments on the policy reform wish list you all would like to have when it comes to the startup ecosystem in India. Garima, you can go first, and then Manindra and Vanessa can follow.
I have a long sundry list, but I think I'll work with the one which is, in our opinion, or in my opinion, very, very challenging and has not been addressed at all in the regulatory framework. Is a lot of startups want to and desire to give advisor equity to a lot of advisors that they take on board. And of course, a lot of structuring goes on in this area. And ESOPs are not a possibility because these advisors are not your employees. And of course, there is this there's sweat equity that can be given, or equity that is that can be given for consideration other than cash. But there are still a lot of restrictive norms, regulatory norms that come up in these structures. So I think one sort of ease of business action that I would like to see is to ease up giving equity to advisors in India. That is one major thing. And the second is, I think, in India, to raise funds also, like Vanessa and Manindra discussed, that there are a lot of instruments that are there. But we still have a lot of regulatory filing that goes on to get this funding in the company. And also, as compared to jurisdictions in the US or Singapore, where the startup ecosystem is more developed than in India, there are a lot of easier norms to take in that money and to structure deals in terms of wanting to say providing giving safe notes or anything of that sort. Like in India, if you would want to give out safe notes, you would still have to structure it as a convertible instrument or a convertible note or something of that sort, right? It's not as easy as just signing an agreement as compared to in the US. So I think that's another move that I would like to see in the reforms.
Vanessa, what's your wish list?
I think I would add to what Garima is saying, and focus should be on easing compliances overall for startups. So everything from filings required when raising funds, board meetings that are required, notice periods for having board meetings, shareholders meetings. So a startup is a dynamic entity, and they need to be have the ability to do and take decisions quickly. We have a notice period of 7 days that you need for board meetings, 21 days that you need for shareholders meetings. If you want these notices to be waived, you need consent from the board members or shareholders. So I think that, just in terms of having easier compliances, whether it is under Companies Act, whether it is maintaining registers under labor laws. So generally, to have easier compliances will help the ecosystem focus more on the business. And some of these compliances, may not be applicable to startups. Some of them may be kind of hindering their ability to be as dynamic as they can be. So easier compliances, single window clearances, rather than having to apply for different registrations, doing away with some of the requirements such as Shops and Establishment Act registrations. So some of these will really help, or having some kind of threshold. So, every startup needs to get certain registrations, but perhaps we introduce a threshold that once they hit 50 lakhs in revenue or 1 crore in revenue. So these kind of things will make it easier for startups to function.
All right, all right. Maninder, are we headed in the right direction when it comes to ease of doing business?
So Krishnendra, I think there is a mixed answer to that. I think there are a lot of policy reforms which are happening. The government is taking a lot of efforts to smoothen out a lot of complexities. For example, I think 10-15 days back only, the convertible notes concept, which is there under FEMA, it had to convert within 5 years, but now they have allowed a time period of 10 years, giving more flexibility to the startup founders to have the convertible notes on their books. So I think they are hearing, the government is hearing what the industry stakeholders are asking them. But I think a lot of that is not trickling down to the reality. A lot of that needs to come into action. The changes that are being made in the laws need to show up in some or the other form. For example, the compliance burden is something which Vanisha pointed out, is something that's a very important thing for a startup to focus at. In the initial phase of their life, they don't want to just be burdened with a lot of compliances. They want to focus more on the business development. And at that point in time, if they don't focus on the compliances and only focus on the business, 3 years or 4 years down the line, when they are about to raise their Series A, Series B, or Series C, or when they're about to become a big company, that is when they start to face challenges that, look, in the initial days you did not do all of these compliances, and hence the investors will start to ask for indemnities and all of those protections, reserve matters, and everything, right? So I think that's one thing that the government really needs to resolve for the startups. And I think by now everybody has recognized startups as a different class of an entity itself. The way we have listed companies in India, there are various different laws governing them. I think we can have a consolidation of all the laws only for startups, so that at least one startup founder doesn't need to bounce through different books, different laws. If he were to only understand that what applies to me when I want to open my shop, I think one holistic law book should be made out for the startups.
All right. That being said, it was a very fruitful discussion on the various aspects of starting up the business. From registration to funding for startups, we covered everything under the sun within a short span. We look forward to having you again for the part 2 of the webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Krishna.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Krishnendra.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Manisha.
Thanks, everyone.